or you're a slacker and you didn't prepare. I'm not looking at my kids when I say that, I promise. They are not slackers. Those boys are really good about being prepared for things. But maybe you've been there and you've experienced that, right? I mean, sometimes we actually have, and in psychology, we have a name for the dream that people experience when they walk into something completely unprepared. Okay, and these are recurring dreams that people will experience. Probably the strangest and most vivid of them that young people, teenagers will experience from time to time is showing up at school either not wearing the right clothes or only wearing their underwear. I mean, strange things because we have this incredible fright of not being prepared for a situation that we walk into. Now, here's what I want to say in that. I am concerned for much of the American church that we are not prepared for the situation we have been walking into for several decades running now. In fact, a good question this morning that Andy asked is, where did some of the things we talked about last week stem from? Tony. Where did these come from? And how long have we been walking through some of this? And the answer is that what we were talking about last week, and we'll refresh that in just a minute, has its roots in what's called the French Enlightenment, and then slowly worked its way over, across the pond to us here, and then became known as postmodern thought. And so that's where we'll pick up from this week. Again, understanding the times, and because we understand the times, then knowing what to do, how do we as a church respond to what is happening around us in the world today. And so we asked last week this question: what is the most influential narrative at play in the Western world? And we had to make the acknowledgement that if you look at a whole bunch of different studies, a lot of different research, whether it be the Pew Research Center, or whether it be Barna, and Barna Group is now different from Barna himself, but Barna at ACU, the Arizona Christian University, has conducted a number of different studies that reveal that it is no longer Christianity. Okay, so the dominant narrative in the Western world today is no longer Christianity. It's actually been replaced by something called secular humanism. We talked about this a little bit last week. Secular humanism. Basically, this idea, humanism with regard in particular to the belief that humanity is capable, and here's the big thing, that humanity is capable of morality. Okay, on our own, we can figure out what's right and wrong. And then self-fulfillment is the other part, without the need for God. In other words, we can do life and everything in it without the need for a God that tells us what life is really all about. Now, this definition, of course, comes from the Oxford Languages Dictionary, but I think it's a very good definition. And what that has led to is what I've already alluded to, the postmodern worldview. And if I were to summarize, as I did last week, what is at the heart of the postmodern worldview, it's first the belief that you and I, that we are capable of making our own truth. Okay, that's the big saying nowadays, and kids and even young adults say it oftentimes, you live your truth. Okay, so truth is then a personal thing. Truth is not objective, but a personal thing. So in other words, what's true for you may not be true for me, and what's true for me may not be true for you. And that is the conclusion of the idea that we make our own truth. Now, the second piece of this, and it just takes us a little bit further, is that we make our own meaning, or we have the ability to define our own meaning in life. I decide what matters and what brings me fulfillment in life. Okay, so if I decide that chasing after X is what's going to bring me fulfillment, then I should chase after X with all of my heart, soul, mind, and strength. Sound familiar, right? I should chase after it with everything I've got, regardless of what anyone else around me thinks. Because as we looked, several of the quotes that we looked at last week, remember, kind of really bring this idea out that, listen, nobody else knows what they're doing in life anyway. So you go do the thing that you want to do most that brings you meaning, and don't worry about what anyone else around you thinks. Okay, this is incredible. This is deepening individualism that we see happening around us. Hyper-individualism, some have called it. Okay, and then the last piece of this, as a reminder, again, is this idea that nothing matters more in life than happiness. What matters most? That you're happy. Right? Nothing matters more in life than happiness. So, Even if there are things out there that you know you probably shouldn't be doing, that maybe are flat out even wrong to do, that everybody around you is telling you, don't do this thing, but you've got in your mind that this thing will make me happy, then let's go do that thing that makes me happy, because what matters most in life is my happiness. And again, this is very much personalized, individualized. So my happiness matters how much? Well, even if I cause you harm in pursuing happiness personally, that's okay, because nothing matters more in life than happiness. Okay, now again, I want to say this. Very much what I'm not trying to do in this series is to rail against culture, but I'm also trying to say that the culture around us is not something we can ignore. We ignore it to our peril. And sometimes when we ignore culture, or when we just rail against culture and don't take the next step to understand culture, what we do is we don't prepare ourselves to be able to engage culture. Okay, so we need to understand the story that the broader culture around us is telling. Understanding is a big deal. Okay, so I've engaged as a counselor. I've shared that with you. I've got a master's in counseling. So I've counseled lots of different couples going through marital struggles, and I've counseled people. I've worked, even engaging in workplaces where people are having difficulties and they're not seeing eye to eye. And sometimes you come and you can help people understand each other better. I use a very simple tool. Give you an example. It's a tool called the Myers-Briggs, which is a personality inventory in a sense, right? So it's a self-assessment, and you take it, you answer a number of questions, and what's wild is, as people read what comes out of that assessment, these are not tests, by the way, because tests you can pass or fail, and you don't pass or fail a personality assessment, right? So you take that personality assessment, and as I start to read back to them the things that are true about the way they are wired, both temperament and personality, first, the individual, it's like light bulbs going on, right? Being turned on. Walking in a dark room, all of a sudden the light was turned on, and now I start to understand these things about myself that I didn't before, and here's why I do this. Then, when you start to engage with the other person, they'll say, I never knew that was important to you, that mattered to you. And I have seen marriages saved because two people who didn't like each other anymore got to the point where they started to understand each other again. Or maybe for the first time started to understand each other. And workplaces that were in disarray and were in chaos, where people start to get along and work together again as a team because understanding came. So how important is understanding? Well, I would say it's pivotal. It matters. We need to understand, and that's very important. And as it relates to culture, we need to understand the dominant narrative in culture, or as you might say, the story that the culture around us is telling. Again, here, 2 reasons real quickly why this is so important. As I said last week, first, unless you and I understand, unless you and I become informed about the stories we believe first, so let's make this personal. And really, we're doing this with the first 2 parts of this message series. We're not pointing fingers at people out there. We're understanding what's happening out there so we can reflect upon it and see first, how much have we been influenced by the reality of the world out there? Right? We know the church is called to be in the world, but finish it with me, not of the world, right? But the reality is, for many, many years, I'd say for 5 to 8 generations now, the church has contented itself with being at arm's length from the world. Anybody feel like the world has changed in the last 5 to 8 decades? So imagine what the church has done when the church has said, we'll stay at arm's length from the world. We've compromised ourselves in the call to holiness because we've said, well, as long as we've got enough distance between us and the world, we're okay. Our standard has never been the world, it's been Jesus Christ. Okay? So unless you and I become informed about the stories we believe, we're just as likely as the culture around us to have no idea what life is about, no real idea what life is about. And then the second piece, okay, this is where we turn and we stop looking internal. We start looking outward. Here's the truth. You and I have been called to engage the world around us with the good news of Jesus. We, the church, has always had the mission of Jesus to go live out and fulfill. Now, there have been times when we've decided, you go all the way back to kind of some of the Middle Ages, and even before that, where the really religious people did what? Well, they all gathered together in a place they called a convent or an abbey, and that is where they all did religion, right? And they were the really spiritual people, and they were pursuing God, and the rest of those folks out there, well, hopefully you show up at church on Sunday and you kind of figure it out on your own in between then. That's not the way we've been called to engage. Now, sometimes we've been so deeply embedded in the world that the world has rubbed up on us so much that we don't look like the church either. So again, the call for us is to be the people of God and then to go into the world as the people of God. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I want to introduce to you a new term. Now I'm going to say this, it's just a new term to this message series. It's not really, it's probably not a new term to you. I would imagine you've likely heard this term. I've mentioned it before myself, but I want to introduce a new term in this message series. And it is this term, and we're going to give it a very specific definition. It's the idea of being post-Christian. Okay, post-Christian. Now, that is what the culture that we live in now is labeled. Okay, we used to live in what was called a Christianized culture where enough of the influence of the church was felt in the world that a lot of things happened in the world like we would hope they would happen in the church. Okay, but a lot of that has changed. So we now live in a post-Christian culture. What's the definition of a post-Christian culture? Well, here it is. No longer embracing, or post-Christian, no longer embracing a Christian worldview or accepting the wisdom of Christian personal ethics as a rule. Now, this personal piece is going to be really important as we walk through the rest of this message this morning, okay? So no longer embracing a Christian worldview or accepting the wisdom of Christian personal ethics as a rule. Now, watch this second part, and you'll see why the personal piece is important. While continuing to enjoy many of the benefits of a society established upon these principles. That is the reality of the post-Christian world. Let me just give you one example of how this plays out. You've probably heard this phrase. You see this on the news from time to time, or if you ever listen into anything kind of political, maybe something happening at the UN, you get these two words put together, human and rights. Now, I want to ask you this question. Where do you think the understanding of human rights came from? Where do you think the idea of human rights came from? I can tell you this, it didn't come from human beings. It did not come from people. Do you know that the pre-Christian world was an incredibly brutal place where life and death were just parts of normal day life? They did not value life the way you and I value life because the idea of equality and the dignity of all human beings comes directly from the Word of God. You don't find that idea anywhere else. Now, Christian influence, we live in a semi-Christianized world where Christian influence has been felt at such a deep, true level that now we're talking about human rights in places where we don't agree with everything that happens maybe in those places, but they're talking about human rights. Why? Because of the influence of the gospel and the message of God. That all human beings are made in the image of God. There are no human rights without that understanding. Okay? So again, we're in this series, Not on My Watch, and we're going to move into now the second part. Now that we have that kind of foundation laid, we're going to move into the second part, and I want to take you into a passage from John chapter 4. You may be familiar with this story. This is called the story of the woman at the well, is what we often refer to this, the Samaritan woman at the well. I want you to see there is in this story a real cultural parallel between what we're experiencing in our society today. Okay? Follow along with me. John chapter 4. If you don't have your Bibles, you can follow along on the screen behind me. So Jesus went to this well with his disciples, and there was this Samaritan woman who came to the water, came to draw water, and Jesus said to her in this moment, again, Jesus is in her town, her area. He said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Now, at this moment, as Jesus and his disciples were traversing Samaria, as this Samaritan woman comes to the well, Jesus has sent his disciples into town to buy food. They were staying out of the town. Jesus sent his disciples into the town. At this point in time, this Samaritan woman comes to this well to draw water, and she says to him, as he asks her for a drink, You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Now, that is John's note in the text, and we'll come back to that and explain that just a little bit, but I want you to hang on to that because it is important. So Jesus now answers her and says to her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that asks you for a drink, watch what Jesus does with this. You would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now, this sounds like a really, really strange thing to say after he's just asked her for water, for a drink, and she replies and says, hey, aren't you nervous because I'm a Samaritan and you Jews consider us unclean and outcasts, and there's racial animus between our two peoples? You know who I am, right? You're asking me for a drink of water. And Jesus flips this whole thing around and says, if you knew really the gift of God, and if you knew who I was, you'd be asking me for water. And she has got to be scratching her head and saying, what do you mean? Now, before we go any further, let's ask the question just in case not everybody understands, and that's great. If you don't know who the Samaritans are, no trouble whatsoever. Let me explain it to you real quickly. Okay? Who are the Samaritans? Well, the Samaritans were a group of people who claimed Jewish lineage. This is important. They claimed Jewish lineage, but they had intermarried with pagans during the time of what is called in the Old Testament the diaspora, the scattering of the Jews. When the Babylonians came and invaded, we spent, about 7-8 weeks in the book of Daniel earlier in 2023. Remember, all of that, the Jews had been taken into captivity. Others had been dispersed to different places. Some stayed in Samaria, or some stayed in Judea and Samaria. And some of them remained faithful as very faithful Jews. Others started to intermarry with pagans in the area and taking on their types of worship. Okay, so they were kind of Jewish and kind of not so Jewish. Right? So what's important to see out of that is that they kept some Jewish tradition. Some Jewish traditions they kept, but they mixed in plenty of pagan tradition. Okay, so to draw a parallel between what we've just talked about, maybe we would call them post-Jewish, I don't know. But you can see there was still some influence. They were living in a society in which many of the underpinnings, especially the good things about Jewish culture, they continued to embrace, but they were very eclectic, and they would bring in parts of pagan culture that they wanted to embrace as well. We call that syncretism. Okay, I'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that. It's basically buffet theology, right? When you go to Golden Corral, how many of you go to Golden Corral or Chinese buffet every now and then? Be honest. Why do we go to those places? Because the world is your oyster, my friend. You get to choose whatever you want at that buffet, fill up your plate, go down, eat that, and then guess what? You can do it all over again if you want to. Right? So, this is kind of the way they were engaging. They were keeping some parts of what they liked, and then what they didn't like, they got rid of. And then what they wanted to bring in from other cultures, they brought in. Sound familiar? Right? Okay, back to the story. So now she replies to Jesus. She says, "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and this well is deep." Okay, she's still thinking physical water very clearly. Listen, you're asking me for a drink, and then you're telling me you can give me a drink. I know how deep this well is. I come here just about every day. So I don't know if she got a little bit sassy with him. I like to kind of imagine maybe that she did. She's kind of rolling her eyes and saying, "You have nothing to draw with, and I know how deep this well is. How are you going to get this living water?" And now she maybe starts to reveal that she does kind of get the hint that there are some theological undertones to what Jesus has been saying. Because she now goes and asks this question. And who does she point to? Jacob. And who is Jacob? Israel. Right? So she says, okay, you a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. We have this common ancestry. I'm going to point back to it. And she says, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? It's Jacob's well, and drank from it himself, and also his livestock and his sons did. So are you greater than him? Basically, the father of this nation that you claim to be a part of, are you greater than him? Jesus now replies, everyone who drinks this water from this well, even Jacob's well, with this incredible history, you can still go and see where Jacob's well is today, by the way. He says, if you drink this well, and you know, because you come here probably every day or every other day, and you know what it feels like to carry that water jug back. And you know the feelings you have every time you look down into that water jug and you realize, it's empty. I got to go back to the well. You know what that feels like when you get to that place where you're thirsty. And Jesus then says these words, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Now, here's kind of, if I could summarize what Jesus is saying, maybe I should have had a water metaphor instead of a fire metaphor in here, but Jesus is basically saying the water that comes out of Jacob's well doesn't hold a candle to the water that I offer, the kind of water that I offer. In other words, you keep coming back to dip water from a well that will never fully satisfy, or you can have living water. So you can keep coming back to this well day after day after day, or you can have living water. Now, it's very plain that this conversation has really shifted, right? From, can I have a drink, to, let me tell you about something I can give you that you can't find anywhere else. It's become it was a physical conversation that has very much now become a theological conversation. And I think she's kind of catching on, as you'll see in a minute. But at the same time, she's still not quite sure what to make of Jesus. As she says to him now, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and won't have to keep coming to draw water from this well. Okay, so God has the power to take, some dough and make it last a really long time, oil last a long, take bread and fish, and he's got the ability to multiply these things. I don't know what she knew about Jesus. I don't know what she thought maybe Jesus was alluding to, but she maybe has this understanding, maybe at a physical level, I'm not sure, that God could do this physical miracle and keep her pitcher, her jar, filling back up all the time. I'm not sure exactly what she was thinking. I'm not sure she knew what she was thinking, because she's probably not quite sure what Jesus is saying to her yet. Now, here's where Jesus takes the conversation and makes it pretty serious. And it's very interesting that Jesus transitions this way. Now, keep in mind, Jesus knew everything about everybody, right? And so Jesus had the understanding of God as he was engaging people. And so here's what he says at this point in time. Again, strange transition, it seems like. He says to her at this point, go call your husband and come back. Now, she may have been thinking in that moment, okay, we're having a spiritual conversation. It's really shifted to be a spiritual conversation. Women were not supposed to sit at the feet of a rabbi in Jesus' day. Now, Jesus broke those rules on several occasions that we know of. But he's engaging with her, and maybe she's thinking in this moment, okay, the conversation has gotten too serious. I need to go get my husband and bring him back, and he can listen to Jesus, and then I can kind of understand through him. It was a very different world than what we live in. And so, maybe Jesus has kind of shifted the conversation that way, but that's not what Jesus is doing. Watch this. Jesus says to her now, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you have now is not your husband. What you have said is quite true. Have you ever had that moment where somebody knows something about you that you feel like they ought not to know about you, and it kind of, you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, maybe it all just kind of drops out. Maybe you've been caught in a lie or something. I don't know what she's experiencing right now, but I bet it was kind of like that. And now she realizes how real this conversation is, and she says to him, I can see, sir, that you're a prophet. You know things that you shouldn't know. So now she engages at the theological level. And she says this, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans, Jesus says, worship what you do not know. You've been disconnected from this thing so long that you really don't know the real God anymore. There's too much paganism in your not Christianity at that point in time, in your Jewish practice. There's too much intermingling of these thoughts, too much syncretism. You don't really know what you're talking about anymore because you don't know the one true God truly. This is what Jesus says. You worship what you do not know, we worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. And the woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, see, she did know some. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then can you imagine the chills that ran down her spine as Jesus replies with these words, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. Now, I think Jesus really, if we take a look at what Jesus is saying in this story to this woman about her story, he's saying, I'm calling you to believe a better story, and it's a better story that centers on me. Yes, you've gone all different places, and a lot of it is not your fault. This goes back generations. There's history to this, but I am the Messiah. Your story should be wrapped up in me instead of your story being wrapped up in yourself. And you can very clearly see her story was wrapped up in herself. She was trying to figure out what life was about. She was probably beaten up and abused by life to some degree. In that culture, I mean, we may want to look at her and say, wow, 5 husbands, and now the one she's married to is not her husband. You have no idea kind of the power that men had in a society like that, just to say, I don't really want to be with you anymore. You can find somebody else. And in that culture, if a woman was not connected to a man, living was a difficult thing. Right? Thank God we're past that. But living was a difficult thing in that culture. And so before we want to throw a lot of aspersions or even rocks at her, we need to realize that a lot of what happened in her life happened out of her control. Okay? Jesus is saying, I'm calling you to believe a better story if we reconnect with last week's language, one that centers on me. Now I want you to see what happened real quickly. Many of the Samaritans, and I want you to see her reaction, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. Now, did he really? I don't know. He told her something about her life, but somehow she knew in that moment, he knows everything about me. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed for 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. I want you to hang on to this line for just a second. He told me everything I ever did. I think, in effect, what she's saying is this. He told me the story of my life. He knew me inside and out. And what he knew about me was this. I had been coming to this well. We're not talking about the physical well. We're talking about what brings meaning to life. What do we say is life about? He told me I had been coming to this well over and over and over again, trying to dip from it. And I wasn't satisfied. And then he told me that in him I could have living water. Now, how does this relate to this idea, not on my watch, understanding the times and knowing what to do? Okay, again, back to this. We need to understand the culture around us. Clearly, Jesus understood the Samaritan culture enough that he could engage with this lady and bring deep truths out of what she was saying and speak deep truths back into her. But again, remember the idea that we're at a place where we're living in a post-Christian culture. Again, that definition one more time in case you've forgotten what it means. They don't value Christian wisdom, Christian values as a rule, but want to enjoy a lot of the things that come out of a Christian culture. So again, these are people who once embraced a Christian worldview, but no longer do. Why and how has this happened? okay, especially in the last several years. And I've got one more term for you, and this actually goes back to the idea of postmodernism and French Enlightenment, by the way, if you want to know. But this word deconstruction, you may have heard this over the last several years being spoken of, especially as people who were once believers start to fall away. And I'm just going to give you what is my definition, because I haven't heard one that I love so much. But definition of deconstruction, it's the act of piece by piece taking apart a belief system, a worldview, that was once adhered to and often replacing it with another. It's often saying, I'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's exactly what the Samaritans had done. It's exactly what many in our culture are doing. And when we talk about deconstructing faith, we often ask the question, why do people deconstruct their faith? Now, this is important. Stay with me. Why do people deconstruct their faith? Why do people who were once believers, why do 8 in 10 kids raised in the church fall away from the church in their early 20s? Man, that's a huge number. Why is that the case? Okay, I want to give you real quickly, and this is not my stuff right here. This is from a guy named John Mark Comer. I mentioned him last week, brilliant thinker. Okay, just real quickly, we're gonna go over this. We could spend a lot of time here, and we're not going to. We're running out of time quickly. He talks about this first at the level of external deconstruction. He says, first, we have to admit, there are times where there was broken trust from spiritual leaders. Something happened in the church you grew up in that did not look like Jesus. Did not look like the church ought to look, and that was enough for you to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Now, oftentimes that's the straw that broke the camel's back, or maybe, I don't want to call it an excuse, but it is the thing that's enough to push someone away, okay? The second one is this, ascendant secular ideologies. This is saying this is the reality of the world we live in. The culture around us has been making what come across as strong arguments for a long time. And if you're not well equipped, you can't argue back well. Okay? If you don't know how to engage the arguments, and we've not been doing a great job at times equipping our children and even our adults to engage the arguments of the culture around us, why their worldview is better than our worldview. And the second is this, and we've got to address this in the church, this idea of cheap grace and a low bar for discipleship. In other words, the belief that we've been selling people short. We go away from the difficult words of Jesus instead of going to the difficult words of Jesus. And often Jesus went to difficult words knowing it would push a crowd away. Jesus said, I can't spare you the difficult stuff. We've got to deal with the difficult stuff. Now, John Mark Comer talks about it at a second level called internal deconstruction. What's happening inside of you, okay? So digital inputs and low scripture. What he's saying is this, and this is the way Barna puts it. Our kids today, Gen Z today, is discipled by the world through digital media at a 20-to-1 ratio when it comes to secular content and Christian content. Okay, 20 hours per week or more of digital content that is secular, 1 hour per week of digital content that is tied to something Christian. What do you think is going to happen when that happens, right? And then very low engagement with Scripture oftentimes. Okay, wounded heart, this one often goes back to the church woundedness, and there are a lot of people who I've talked with who deal with this, and then this last one, it's a lack of a fear of God. It's that, again, we're not engaging the holiness of God as we ought to. We're not talking about how holy God is. We're not talking about the fact that judgment is a real thing. And yes, it sounds terrible because it's going to be it will be a terrible thing. But God has not left us without hope in the face of eternal judgment. Not at all. Okay, so as we wrap up, as we think about what can we do, I want to share with you real quick, and you can go and look this up. It's an article I wrote several years ago on a website called renew.org called 6 Reasons We're Drawn to Christianity's Deconstruction Stories. 3 of these matter for today. I'll show you all 6, but we're going to move through some of them very quickly. First, can we be honest? Even if you have been a Christian for a long time, there have been times in your life where you have bumped into some questions internally that really make you wrestle with your faith. Right? I mean, they're going to make you wrestle for a little bit, whether it be disappointment or hurt or heartache or a hard question that someone asks you. It'll make you wrestle. Now, the second piece is this. Many of us don't have a safe place to ask these questions. I won't go into this story long, but there is a young, well, he's not so young anymore. There's a kid who was a part of a youth group when I was a youth minister. I still engage with him today. He walked away from the church because he was asking some difficult questions. I was engaging with him, and an elder went to him and told him, those are the kind of questions we don't ask here. I mean, that was the gist of the conversation. Okay, you got to stop asking those questions in class. And his grandkids were in that class. And so he didn't like the fact that this young man was asking some difficult questions in class. But if the church is not a safe place to ask difficult questions, where is? And if those difficult questions aren't answered in the church, guess what? Google will answer them. And I'd rather answer them in here than let Google take a shot at them, right? Okay? Third, doesn't matter so much, but this is true too. There's a raging mistrust of anything institutional. Fourth, not for this conversation matters as much as well too, but we're drawn against me, against the world narratives. Next one, very real pressures from the culture around us. Does matter, it is important, but this last one is what's really, really, truly important. Here's what breaks my heart inside the church is that at some point we have forgotten just how beautiful the Christian worldview and faith in Jesus are. I mean, we've forgotten that we have, good news is selling it short. We have great news, the best news. There is no better news. We got a God who loves us steadfastly. I want you to see these words one more time. Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And so I want to bring you to the place where Jesus brought the woman at the well to. I mean, he confronted her with this idea. You can keep coming back to dip water from a well that will never fully satisfy. And as we talked about it last week, this idea that we make our own truth, define our own meaning and purpose and value in life, and nothing matters more than happiness, is not working. Secular research reveals that it is not working. More people unhappy than they've ever been, to the point that we have more young men taking their lives at this point in our society than we ever have. It's sad. But it's because of this. Any worldview that is not centered on Jesus will never truly satisfy. We could replace that with this word, it will never fully satisfy. Even the worldviews that want to keep what they think is good and dismiss the rest. We're just going to borrow a little bit of Christianity here because this is like the good stuff here. Again, we're wrapping up here. What can we do? What can I do? Well, here at Southside, tomorrow we jump into 2 weeks of prayer together, and I hope that you will join in this. You can find this on your app, okay, on your Southside app. Every week, if you receive my emails, or every day if you receive my emails, I will be emailing the prayer devotionals out for you to start your day with. We're going to be praying for purpose, knowing that that purpose can only be found in God. We're going to be doing it together as a group. There's power in this. Okay, you can also find it on the website. Then, if your life has not been centered on the things of God, choose to recenter your life on the things of God, because we're all vulnerable to distraction. Another way of saying this is this: fall in love again, or for the first time, with Jesus, with his ways, with his good news. And here's what I can promise you out of that. If you seek out the true and living water that's already been offered to you, you will not be disappointed. Church, we've got to be the kind of folks that say, not on my watch are we going to settle for something else that's not Jesus. That's not where real and true life is found. And then when we embrace that ourselves, we can hold that life out to others as well. Let's choose to do this. If you this morning need to respond in any way, maybe if you're here this morning and you want to say, hey, I've kind of taken a few steps backward. I need to take a step toward Jesus. You can choose to do that right where you are. You can also come forward and respond the way that we have for generations. I mean, you can come forward and ask for prayers. If you're at a place too where you want to hear more about this living water that changed the woman's life 2,000 years ago, the woman at the well, if you believe that water could change your life also, don't leave today without having that conversation. We're going to stand right now and we're going to sing together a song of invitation. I hope you will sing along with us. And again, don't settle for anything but the real, true, living water. Let's lift his